Well, good afternoon and welcome again to the Stelter's webinar series. We're here in November. It feels like the longest year and the shortest year. It's flown by, but equally dragged on. We're really excited today, and I'm excited to have Dr. Russell James sharing one of his latest talks, one that he shared at the National CGP online conference this year, putting research to work in your plan giving program, getting leadership support and donor dollars. And I'll talk a little bit about Russell and kind of his background, much of which hopefully many of you know. But real quick, before we do, I wanted to say a couple words about the webinar series. Many of you are familiar, obviously, with what Stelter's been doing the last 4 or 5 years in the webinar series. This is a free series that we have made available to anybody in the industry. And as a leader, we're committed to doing that and continuing to do that. But we're happy to host today's complimentary webinar, as well as a whole slate of webinars. I think this is actually our 11th this year. We've got one more slated. A good friend, Johnny Hayes, will be joining us here in a couple weeks, December 2nd, to talk about how to eliminate delays obtaining IRA death proceeds. So she's done a lot of work in that area with the National Association of Charitable Gift Planners, and we'll be sharing some of those insights to everybody. So you can register, as always, going to stelter.com/webinars for any of those talks, or you could actually access any of the archives there as well. In regards to today's talk, I'm actually excited to not only introduce Russell and the work that he's going to share today, but also share with the group that he's also agreed to present as our first of 2021 presenters. So in January, he's going to be presenting his other talk, well, one of many, but raising major gifts of assets in the aftermath, or whatever variation of COVID-19 we are in January. So we'll have the date and all those things nailed down in the coming couple weeks. But wanted to share that little note as well. So for today's presentation, as I mentioned, our esteemed colleague, Dr. Russell James, is joining us. You can see a little bit of all the things that he's done in this great industry, but I think one of the greatest things, and I won't go through his entire bio, but I think one of the greatest things about Russell and what he's brought to this industry and the breath of fresh air over, gosh, I don't know how many years it's been. It's just kind of blended together, is his perspective, because he's worked in the shoes. He's been in the office of the plan giving department. He's run and been the president of a college, and so has had to look at things from that perspective as well. And now as an academic researcher in the work he's doing at Texas Tech and nationally and internationally with the insights he's gleaning, he's really able to give a unique perspective to all the things that fundraisers are challenged with and that donors expect to see and hear from us. So outside of all the places he's spoken and outside of the places he's been referenced between the Journal and CNN, MSNBC, all the different places, again, I think what he's done and what he continues to do for this industry is truly outstanding, and very honored to have him as our guest speaker today. So I will pass it on to you, Russell, and the rest is yours.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nathan. Well, I'm looking forward to presenting some of them relatively new results just coming out this year about putting research to work in your plan giving program. Now, before we get into this, I have to say, I think if you're like me, many of us have been living in Zoom land, and I have to say a shout out to Nathan, because I do actually like the go to webinar format, and I'll give you a little secret as to why that is. Well, sometimes slides don't look the same on Zoom, and that's because they put your picture right over the slide that you're using. And I did have Simon Williams at the Nature Conservancy sent me this photograph from a presentation I was giving to the Plan Giving Roundtable of Northern Nevada, and I did not realize that my inner RuPaul was coming out during that presentation. But no worries for that, because this platform, we keep things separate. So look, we've got some new information, we've got some new data, we've got some new longitudinal empirical regression analysis, new results. And if you're a data guy like me, well, that is super exciting. But I'm going to temper your excitement a little bit, because we've got to get practical. Look, the numbers can be interesting, and I'm just as interested or more so than anyone you might meet. But to put research to work in your organization, It's got to actually do something. And what I want to talk about today is how we can put this latest research to work to do two simple things. One is to, number one, sell your planned giving work to your leadership, that is to sell it to your organization. And then number two, oh, by the way, how do we actually get dollars in the door to advance the missions of our organization? So those are really the two topics we're going to be looking at today, and seeing what does research and the data, including the new results, tell us about how to get that done. So let's start with the first of those two topics. And I want to start with the hardest audience. So I'm going to talk about selling to the CFO. Now, of course, you've got lots of other people you may want to sell to, but I want to start with the toughest customer. Now, and here's why. You know, I love going to plan giving conferences, and I've really been missing that opportunity. I mean, it's super efficient to do things by webinar and Zoom, but it's so much more fun to get together with actual human beings face to face and talk about plan giving. And they're great. And we get really revved up and ready to go, but then we get back to the office, and sometimes budgets get cut or other responsibilities get added. You know, the wonderful atmosphere of that conference can tend to fade. So I want to talk about this reality, and how is it that we can get leadership to support plan giving, fundraising, plan giving in investments. Now, I've talked about this in terms of selling to the CFO, but your decision makers may be different, right? Could be an executive director or board members, or you know, whoever it is in your org chart that you need to talk to. But let me talk in terms of selling to the toughest customer, that being the CFO. So who is this target? The risk-averse herd animal known as the nonprofit CFO. Well, what are some of the initial problems that we have selling planned giving fundraising and investing in planned giving fundraising to this kind of administrator? Well, the first challenge is this. Look, they've got a lot of crises, like right now crises to deal with this year, probably more than most. So planned giving seems like a someday in the future thing to get to. You know, we'll get to that, but look, right now we've got pressing urgent needs. You want to talk about the metrics, and here's what we've got going in the Legacy Society. Well, look, for an accountant, a lot of those numbers are just sort of happy talk, right? They're not anything we can put on a spreadsheet to actually legitimately say that this is an asset. And beyond that, a lot of what fundraisers do just creates headaches for the CFO. Donor restrictions, well, they're just the devil. And blended gifts and other complex instruments, that's just a deeper level of hell. You know, donors should just learn to write the check and get out of the way. So this is kind of the attitude, the ideas that we might have to deal with. And the question is, how do we deal with that? How do we address that? And what I want to suggest is, as much as I love statistics, we need two things. We still need the statistics, but we also need the story. And so what I want to start with is to kind of flip the script on planned giving. Planned giving, we usually talk about long-term results, but I want to start out with that. I want to start out with talking about near-term results. How does planned giving get dollars in the door right now? So just as a quick note, these results are all published, I would say, or forthcoming. Actually, they're all published because the most recent result just came out a few weeks ago in academic journals. These all came out in 2020. If you're interested in all the sort of long law review articles and all the numbers on this, please do connect with me on LinkedIn. Or if you're not on that, just send me an email and I'll send you links to all of these things. Also, if we're connected on LinkedIn, you haven't heard from me in 2 or 3 years, just send me a quick note and I'll give you the updated list of, you know, all of my research and slide sets and videos and all that stuff. So let's start with the story. The story that I think is the most powerful one here is to understand that what we want to focus on is raising gifts of assets, not gifts of disposable income. Fundamentally, from a psychological, from a behavioral economics perspective, the single most important transformation we can make with the donor is to shift their mindset, their point of reference, from making gifts out of disposable income, those tend to be cash gifts, to make out of wealth, those tend to be assets. This changes the reference point for what is considered to be a large gift. If I'm making a gift out of cash, I'm going to naturally compare that to my disposable income, what I just spent at Starbucks. If I'm making a gift of stocks or real estate, I'm going to naturally compare that to my portfolio, to my wealth. And that reference point changes the perception of the gift size. It makes wealth donation relevant. This is an idea that came from actually year before last, the winner of the Nobel Prize in economics, the idea called mental accounting. People will attach labels to different kinds of money or wealth and then treat them differently based upon those labels. The first time we can get a donor to make a gift out of wealth, which tends to be a gift of assets, it changes the donor reference point and mindset from that point forward. And I want to show you some statistics that really back up just how powerful that kind of transformation can be. Now, first, let me begin with this. And this is some research that came out just a couple years ago where we looked at over 1 million nonprofit tax returns over a 6-year period. And we were trying to see what is it that predicts who's going to be growing their contributions, charitable contributions, and who's just going to be stuck in the mud. And the most powerful indicator that came out of that was one simple idea. Is the organization raising any gifts from assets, that is stocks and real estate, either publicly traded or closely held stocks or real estate? That one indicator was a massive, massive predictor of where the organization was going to be 5 years from now. Look, if we looked at all organizations starting out raising at least $1 million a year, and we wanted to see on average where are they going to be 5 years from now, if the organization only raised gifts from cash consistently, both at the beginning and at the end, those organizations on average grew their contributions by about 11% total over 5 years. That's the same as the inflation rate. Organizations that included any gifts of stocks in their securities, in their contributions consistently, both at the beginning and the end, their average growth rate was 6 times larger. Massive, massive increase over time. We found that was true regardless of what time period we looked at, regardless of whether we were looking at the same year, 3 years later, 5 years later, regardless of what sector we looked at 26 different sectors, it was always the same result. So that's the beginning point. Here is something a bit more recent, came out just this year from UC Davis Law Review publication, where we looked at nationally representative data from adults age 50 and above that have been tracked for over a quarter of a century, getting close to 30 years now that this study has been going on. And because it's been going on so long and is nationally representative, we can actually look at how does behavior change, charitable giving behavior, after a person includes charity in their estate plan. And what we see here is you can see this is a dramatic, almost a 77% increase in average annual charitable giving after a person puts a charity in their estate plan. Now, keep in mind, these are the same people before and after. Only their behavior has changed. Now, what's going on with that change of behavior? Well, there's lots of different discussions and argument as to what's happening, but one thing we do know is regardless of the size, a gift in a will is not a gift of disposable income. It is not a gift of pocket change. It is a gift of wealth. And for many donors, the very first time they have committed to a gift from their wealth, a gift of assets from their wealth, is when they make that commitment in an estate plan by adding that charitable component. So I believe both of these results, which fundamentally are the only two things I've seen in research that massively increase charitable giving, and not just in an experiment, but in real world, and also increase it for a sustained period of time. 2 years later, 4 years later, 6 years later, 8 years later. So whether we're looking at the organization side or we're looking at the donor side, is here, it's this same result. If we get that first gift from wealth, in this case committed through an estate gift, all of a sudden the current giving becomes transformed. The reference point changes, and that's what's so powerful. By the way, for those that are in statistics, you may be interested in this. Now, you notice the average giving went up about 77%, and that was sustained. But we might wonder, well, was that just driven by a few very large gifts? And the answer was no, it wasn't. So for example, there's another way you can look at the data that just says what's a person's propensity to make gifts of $1,000 or more. And that propensity went up substantially after they include a gift to charity in their will. And of course, this measurement is not dramatically affected by, very large donors. It's just a yes or a no. Did people make that gift? Then I had a later question came up, was this. Some organizations are really focused on major gifts. And so they said, okay, well, that's fine that the typical donor goes up, but what about somebody's propensity to make major gifts? And when I was working with Joe Bull, he asked me to run this analysis because he said, look, in the organizations that I've been in, major gift is $50,000, which is $10,000 for a 5-year period. So I took a look at that. What is the likelihood of a person's making a gift of at least $10,000 a year before and after they include charity in an estate plan? And we see in many ways an even more dramatic and sustained result from there. So across the board, we see very powerful effects. Now, aside from those statistics, and I do want to emphasize that these numbers we're looking at, these aren't just slides on a presentation. This is from one of the top 25 law review journals in the country. This is from published peer-reviewed academic journals, and of course I'm happy to send you copies of any of those. So it is as hard as we can get in terms of hard evidence. Now, having talked about the statistics, I now want to shift to talking about the story. The story, which is supported by the statistics, is that what we're talking about here is encouraging major gifts of assets, not gifts from disposable income. So I want to encourage you to try this. Stop selling leadership on planned giving, or at least that phrase. Because when leadership thinks of planned giving, they think of someday, and they've got a crisis right now, okay? Instead, think about selling them on this phrase, major gifts of assets. Now, major gifts of assets is more compelling to leadership because it's big, they love major gifts, it's now, but it's also later. And here's an important psychological issue. Major gifts of assets is not death talk, right? Which is sometimes one of the psychological barriers we have to overcome to get investment in legacy fundraising. Now, why do I say major gifts of assets? Well, look, here's the fundamental reality. You cannot competently ask for a major gift of assets if you don't understand assets, right? You can't ask for a gift of securities if you don't know what a capital gain tax is. If you don't know that you can avoid those capital gains tax by making gifts of appreciated assets. If you don't know that you can avoid those capital gains taxes and get income off of those for the rest of your life. If you don't understand that you can, for example, donate the inheritance rights to farmland or a house and immediately get an income tax deduction for that. So you see how this one phrase basically is the camel's nose in the tent that says, okay, we want to ask for major gifts of assets. That means you need to know these things that we would call planned giving. And by the way, if you don't know those, not only is, of course, there's fantastic resources from Stelter. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, I'll send you a link to my 65 short animated videos that cover all of plan giving. So that's all free, and you can learn about all of those details along the way. Here's a second powerful message, especially when it comes to leadership. And that magic message is you're losing. Now, remember, these are risk-averse herd animals. If you can show an organization, a competitor who's doing it better, that is more compelling than any argument you might try to make. And I'll share this with you that happened with me when, and this was just shortly before the pandemic, when I was given the opportunity to talk to the Texas Tech Foundation board. Now, by the way, you should never let a tenured professor talk in front of a board like that, because we're a little bit of wild cards, right? And here's what I did to try to get my point across. I found an organization, this was another university that's in our athletic conference, that they perceived as a competing, as a sister organization, right? Who is absolutely kicking our butts when it comes to major gifts of assets and plan giving in general, frankly. And why is that? Well, spoiler alert, years and years of major investment in staffing, right, and training. But what I did was, and you can do this for your organization, this is just from the IRS Form 990. IRS Form 990s are completely freely available online. There's half a dozen different places that host those websites that'll give them to you for free, and you can go and look. And this comes from Schedule M on the IRS Form 990. Find a competitor who's doing it better, and then use that as the example to say, we're losing out. That kind of approach really appeals to that risk-averse administrator. And not only does it do that, but it actually led to a lot of conversations of board members who were donors about making these gifts of assets. So this, I can say from personal experience, is very powerful. All right, so let me talk numbers for a little bit. One of the challenges we've got right now in estate giving is that fundamentally we're going blind. Our estate tax numbers are disappearing. Exemption amounts, a married couple, they got to be quite a bit over 22 million before we can even see them. Probate data, which is hard to get to, but now it's disappearing because everything's going through transfer on death designations or trusts. So we're more and more just in the land of estimating. So I'm going to show you some numbers more recent and also further back, because we had better data going further back. Now, the reason I say this is because as a researcher and as a plan giving advocate, this is a bit frustrating, because in the UK, they actually have organizational level data. You can look exactly at your competitor and you can see who's doing a better job, who's winning and losing, knowing who to copy, knowing what practices are the best practices. And that's one of the reasons why, relative to other kinds of fundraising, legacy fundraising is much more massively invested in the UK as compared to the US. Now, I say all that just to put in my little pitch, and there's really great work taking place with the National Association of Charitable Gift Planners right now on this, that if we could get a slight addition to the IRS Form 990, we already have to report 26 different types of non-cash gifts. If we could just get a report of bequest gifts on that, then we would actually have this kind of competitive information, which I think could be transformational. All right, let's look at some of the data. We can't tell precisely because we don't have organizational level data. People aren't sharing that information right now. But let me explain to you why you have competition. For example, among charitable decedents, females on average included 4 organizations in their estate plans, and males included 3 organizations. So on average, you're going to have competition. Now, from estate tax returns filed in 2003, only 38% of charitable decedents left their money all to just one organization. 30% gave to 2, 30% gave to 3 or more, and 5% gave to 10 or more. It's an overall average about 3.5. So you do have competition, and you need to keep that in mind. Now, we've been talking about the short-term results. Now I want to talk about the actual estate dollars coming in the door. So those are going to be long-term results. And once again, we need stories and we need statistics. Now, the first thing that's very powerful that comes out of these statistics is that estate giving, fundamentally, it's how rich people give. So this shows from estate tax data the estate giving to annual giving multiple for different decedents based upon their wealth levels. And notice what you see here. If somebody's under $2 million, well, they still make estate gifts, but they're only relatively high compared to their current giving. As you go up the wealth scale, the share of giving that comes from the estate gift rather than from current giving goes up, up, up. So if you've got leadership that cares about the major, massive, massive transformational gifts, well, this is how the ultra high net worth people give. This is how this happens. Now, one of the reasons why that is, fundamentally, it's psychological. I got to tell you this, and it may be no shock to you, but wealthy people like to hold wealth. Now, you may have heard this idea that, well, the way it works is you're supposed to build up your wealth during your working years, and then you hit 65 or some age and you start spending it down during retirement. Okay, that's not how wealthy people behave. If we look at the top 6% of wealth holders, which is what this chart is looking at, wealth increases every year, even up to age 98. You know what happens to the wealth among the top 6% of wealth holders when they hit age 65? Their wealth accumulation actually increases. It goes up even faster. So this is the reality that we're looking at with this. Now, let's talk some other statistics. What about the eternally forthcoming charitable wealth transfer? Some of you have been around for a while, have been hearing about this for decades, and fundamentally, we just had a lot of basically crying wolf too soon. The publicity was premature, and the reason is simply this: wealthy people die old. And it turns out not only do wealthy people die a lot older, but wealthy donors die older than others of their same wealth category who are not wealthy. And so because of that, what it means is that the actual age at which the real dollars are transferred to charity is much, much older than you might have otherwise anticipated. It's not the average age of death by any means because of these two factors. So for example, decedents age 86 and above transferred 55% of charitable estate dollars. And this is going back to 2003 when we had a lower exemption amount. We could see a larger share of the charitable estate dollars. One Australian study looking at everyone showed that decedents age 90 and above, so I say everyone, there's no estate tax exemptions there. These are from probate records. Decedents age 90 and above transferred half of charitable estate dollars. So what that means is that that midpoint at which you should have gotten about half of the dollars you're going to get from a group of donors is somewhere older than age 86 and maybe around age 90. So you're talking about, let's call it age 88, all right? Now, what do the demographics tell us about people who are age 88? It's in the baby boom, folks. This is the baby bust. And we are right now just at the very lowest point of that baby bust for folks who are around age 88, okay? Now here's the good news. The good news is that, the next 20 plus years, it's nothing but up, up, up for this group that actually transfers the dollars to charity. So you're in a great space. But you can see the effects of the baby boom explain why the dollars haven't been going up in recent years. Okay, how do we get dollars in the door? And I got to tell you, we're shifting gears here now. This is not about making the case internally. You may not even want your internal folks to know some of this, but I want you to know it because it's very powerful. Number one, getting in the estate plan early fantastic. Already seen how it increases current giving. By the way, it also increases estate giving. Those who have had a charitable component in the plan longer tend to give more. Plus, you can then have conversations about switching that gift to irrevocable gifts like a charitable remainder trust or retained life estate deed or a charitable gift annuity. But this is super important. Count it and forget it does not work. It doesn't work to get estate dollars in the door because these charitable components of estate plans are highly fluid, particularly in the last 2 to 5 years of life. Now, this is a chart looking at those age 55 and above, or age 50 and above, and looking at what is the 10-year retention rate on average for a charitable component in an estate plan. And we get a remarkably consistent result from a nationally representative study here. Among older adults, only about 55% of charitable estate components remain in the estate plan at least 10 years. Hey, by the way, there's a lot more of this fluidity going on than you realize or than your donors even realize. And here's why. When you start the estate planning process, let's say you actually go into the lawyer's office, okay? When I was an estate planning attorney in practice, somebody comes into my office, I need to know, and there's a questionnaire and sort of things that go along with that. What do they own? Who are their family members? And what do they want to have happen? That's the only thing I need to know. I am not going to charge them the time to read through the old will document, okay? Because we're getting ready to revoke that document. Unless there's some capacity issue, don't really care what's in that document. And so it starts from the ground up, which means if you're not top of the mind right at that point of decision, you're going to get dropped without any recognition that you're being dropped. In the same way, every time your donor opens an IRA and they say, okay, who's beneficiaries, they don't realize that they're disinheriting the charity when they put the kids down, or some other family members, right? They don't realize that they're cutting the charity out. So there's a lot of dropping behavior that's taking place here. Okay, let's look at some numbers around this dropping behavior that are specific to organizations. What about people who have actually told your organization, you are in my estate plan, I have a gift there? So these we would consider legacy society members. Do we see this same level of fluidity among those legacy society members? Well, just brand new published research looking at 10 leading Australian charities, providing data from 2014 to 2017, looked at all of those, what we would call legacy society members, and looked at all of them who had died, and then see, okay, what percentage of those actually generated any kind of a gift. 35% did not generate any gift. Now notice with the generic data, not those who had actually reported to the organization, we had about a 45% loss rate. Okay, here we have a 35% loss rate, which makes sense because they're taking that extra step to report to the charity. So one of the things though to keep in mind is that the way that the data comes in, this 35% loss rate is actually kind of a minimum, because it's more likely that there are deceased donors that they don't know actually were deceased, who didn't leave a gift. Whereas if they left a gift, they're deceased because you get the money. Here's an important part about the data beyond just the 35% loss rate. Among these 10 leading organizations, the lost gift rate was massively different. It varied all the way from 17% to 60%, depending upon the organization, which means there's a lot you can do at an organization to impact this this loss rate. And here's an example. One of the reasons we know the average loss rate was only 24% when the charity had at least one communication with the decedent within the last 2 years of death. If they had no communications with the decedent in the last 2 years of death, that loss rate more than doubled. Now, this gap is actually likely larger because, again, we're not likely to know if they stopped communicating with them. They may not have even known that they have passed away. So what does this mean? Do legacy societies work? The answer is legacy societies don't work unless you do. These are 10 of the largest leading charities, and what they reported is over 30% of those who had confirmed the presence of a bequest gift to the charity did not receive a single of any type from the charity during their final 2 years of life. So a lot of people are doing a really bad job with this. By the way, you do actually have to help donors get all the way through the process. Folks that were just intending, say, I'm thinking about it, I'm intending to do this, I'm considering doing it, 89% actually generated no gift at death. If they just asked for information, 95% generated no gift at death. So we actually do have to help them through the process. So what am I saying? Well, I'm saying the score doesn't count until the clock runs out. Getting in the will is great, but we've got to stay in touch all the way until the end of the game. Since I grew up in Kansas City, here's an example of where in the playoffs last year, the Houston Texans were up 24-0. At that point, things looked really good for Bill O'Brien. Obviously, you see his press conference here afterwards. Things didn't look so good after he got outscored 51-7. And of course, he's got fired earlier this year. But the point is, the score doesn't count until the clock runs out. So how do we count effectively? Well, look, if you want the back office technical wonky way to do it, and don't ever share this with donors, is we know how to calculate the value for an irrevocable gift, okay? IRS tables allow us to do this. So all you got to do is to calculate what is the discount for that irrevocable gift. Pick your interest rate, a reasonable interest rate, not the crazy low ones we've got going on right now, and calculate what is the value of this gift if it was irrevocable, if you know the dollar amount. If you don't, then you can just kind of use your average bequest gift amount, and then just double that discount rate. The reason you double it is that you've got a risk of revocation. So for example, if it's worth, say, 52% of face value, then you say 52% of 52%, right? And so then it's down to about a quarter. Now, why do you go through all these machinations? Well, here's the thing. If you're valuing gifts that way, every few years there is value to reconfirming that that gift exists. You see how this works, where we can now give credit for maintaining the relationship, not just credit for starting the relationship. And so at each several years, if we have maybe a face-to-face confirmation, we can give credit to fundraisers to maintain those relationships. But hey, use whatever metrics work for your organization. And by work, I mean use what gets you resources to your organization. And if it helps your organization to fund plan giving because you can create funny money numbers that help say that you've reached your campaign goals, then by all means do that, because plan giving investment is massively, massively higher return on investment than any other kind of fundraising investment. So do keep that in mind. Hey, we've got to emphasize, it's still about decisions made near the end of life. Great to get in the will early, but we've got to stay with it all the way to the end. This is from a national sample of probate records, and we see that the actual dollars transferred to charity, 76% of those dollars are transferred by will documents signed in the 80s, 90s, or older. If you're interested in documents signed before age 70, that's only 13% of the dollars. And one of the things that we know from the US data is not only that these documents are being signed at these older ages, but the charitable component is being changed near the end of life. 61% of charitable decedents indicated during life that they had no charitable component at some point within the last 5 years of their life. High amount of end-of-life instability. Now, here's why this is such a big issue. It's such a big issue because look at what happens to those who actually, so these are people who actually transfer dollars to charity at death. Look at what happens to their behavior in the years leading up to death. Their likelihood of donating goes from almost 60% to in the 30s, 39%. Likelihood of volunteering, it's cut, by more than a third, or if it drops by actually more than 2/3. Here's the problem. The problem is you got charities that are communicating based with their oldest friends based strictly upon recency. Do you see the problem here? These systems are precisely designed to fail. Communication based on recency of donation is precisely the wrong approach for your oldest friends, because what it guarantees you is that in most cases, at that most critical point of decision making, which is the last 3 to 5 years before death, you will go completely radio silent. So I want to suggest to you, stop doing this stupid thing. And how do you do that? You need to commit separate resources to age stratified communication. If you've got friends that hit some magic age, and you can pick the magic age. I like age 75. If you want to pick 80, that's fine. If you don't have that much money, you want to pick an older age, that's fine. But once they hit that magic age, you make a commitment. We will not stop communicating. We will not stop being top of the mind to this group of donors. Okay, because the score doesn't count until the clock runs out. And again, hey, one side note is your return on investment is going to arrive much faster with this group. So don't ignore your oldest friends. And while we're in this, do keep in mind, you want to keep it simple. You want to keep it story. Although numerical ability declines strongly with age, it peaks around age 25, so I'm on the downhill for sure. Verbal knowledge is much more strongly retained. So keep it simple, keep it story when we're communicating. Not only do we want to have story, but we want to emphasize the donor's story. We actually know this from neuroimaging, that the way that people make these charitable bequest decisions is to go through this, what you might call an autobiographical visualization or a life review process. So when we share stories of others like the donor who make gifts that reflect their life story in their wills, that's a very powerful, influential message. Okay, let me shift gears now and talk about how do we sell donor instructions to the leadership. This is always a big challenge, selling donor instructions, what they would call restrictions. Now look, fundamental reality we know both experimentally and observationally is this: large gifts come with lots of instructions. If you want major gifts, if you want major gifts of assets, those only come when we allow donors to put instructions with the gift. That's what makes the gift compelling. That's what makes the gift reflect the donor's values, the donor's life story, the donor's identity. When we allow instructions, that's what makes the gifts large. This is not a new thing. Humans are not just brand new, recently invented. We see this same thing in 2 studies of wills from the 1800s. Charitable bequests were restricted. That means they had extensive instructions in 14% of small cash gifts, 58% of real estate or large cash gifts, and in 70% of gifts that left an entire share of the estate, the share of the entire estate to the charitable organization. So nothing new here. We actually know this from experiments. In experiments, if we allow donors to put instructions with a gift, it increases their willingness to give and the size of those gifts. We want to include instructions that reflect the donor's identity. And by the way, you got some serious competition in this space, because guess who's kicking your organization's butt when it comes to getting estate dollars? It's the most extreme version of gift instructions: private family foundations. Foundations, funds, and trusts get the lion's share of these dollars. This is pages of detailed instructions controlling that gift for decades or even generations, that it fits the donor's values. What do I mean by them taking the lion's share? Look, among decedents in 04 and 07, back when we had better data, with estates of 5 million or more, the share of all charitable dollars going to private family foundations was 70%, and then it was 78%. 78% of the dollars are going to private family foundations. That's your competition. Make your leadership understand that's who you're competing against when they start getting all gripey about donor restrictions, right? That's your competition. We don't do they won't do donor instructions because they want to provide value to donors, even though they should. They'll do donor instructions because they have to, because this is the competition and this is who's winning right now. So this means if we want larger gifts, I can tell you how to get larger estate gifts, and that's simply, we need to add some instructions. What do? We simply say, have you ever thought about how you would like your gift to be used? Now look, maybe the donor hasn't even told you how much that gift is. They just say, I've included you with the gift in my will, and they're not sort of keen on revealing how much that is. Just ask this question. Donor says, well, I don't know. Then you share a story about another donor like the person you're talking to, and you'll point out some way that they're like them. And if you can't think of it, just say, you remind me of another donor who has included a gift in their will that accomplishes something specific. Well, the reason I ask is, there was another donor I was working with that you remind me of, and what she did was she included she'd spent her whole career helping other people get their finances in order, and so she included a gift in her. One day we'll create a professorship for our financial planning department. And so those start at $1.5 million, and she decided to put that in. Okay, then you're going to get a reaction. Maybe that reaction is, oh, no, my gift's not that. Okay, now I'll tell a story about a scholarship, because the scholarship is going to start at $50,000, not at $1.5 million, right? Depending upon what reaction that I get. And when we're talking about the impact that this gift is going to make, remember, whenever we are in a death context, the impact that you want to sell, always a permanence impact. That's why endowment works great, scholarship works great, even just using permanence language. And if you're a small organization, then just set up an endowment with your local community foundation, because they've got that sense of stability as well. Those things are very powerful in this space. Should you give a few people the red carpet treatment, or treat everyone the same? It depends upon what your goals are. Are your goals to get dollars in the door, or to have a larger legacy society? If you want to get dollars in the door, well, look, I got to tell you, the data says one thing, that is, we're in the world of extremistan. Only a few people actually transfer the big dollars. Extremistan is sort of like fishing in an ocean that has nothing but whales and sardines. There's a lot more sardines, but they're kind of irrelevant. So for example, among charitable decedents, the typical behavior is to leave less than 10% of the estate to charity. Over 60% of charitable estate tax returns showed these typical gifts, and these typical decedents actually transferred only 3.8% of all charitable bequest dollars. It was only the most extreme that drove the numbers. Those who left at least 90% of their wealth to charity gave more than 55% of all charitable bequest dollars, even though that was less than 10% of the donors. So another example, back when we had $1 million estate tax exemptions, those transferring less than $100,000 to charity, that was typical. That was the majority, but they only represented about 1% of charitable bequest dollars. Extremistan is becoming more extreme. The very top are actually transferring a larger and larger share of these dollars. Who are these people? They're wealthy, got to have it to transfer it. They're very old, and they're childless. Those are the indicators. In fact, ever since we've gotten 50 million plus category, this group of usually about 186 decedents, they actually transfer the majority of all charitable estate gifts. This has always been the case. We can go back to 1922, over half of all charitable estate gifts came from just 16 decedents. And this is getting more extreme. It's about the oldest old. So for example, if we go back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you see the share of gifts coming from those aged 75 and above went from 65% up to 81%. And if we look at the share of charitable dollars coming from those who are even older, age 80 and older, you can see how in the 80s and 90s, this share has increased even more. So again, It is also about the childless. In one analysis, although childless were less than 10% of decedents from a nationally representative study, they actually represented a majority of the charitable estate dollars coming in. So again, I just want to end by saying we need to look at the story and the statistics. Just to review, the story is we want to get gifts from wealth, not disposable income. We want to talk about major gifts of assets, not death talk, not legacy giving, not plan giving, when we're talking internally, selling to the internal audience. And for the internal audience, we want to emphasize the competition. Find from the 990 results the organization doing it better. Explain how the Private Family Foundation is our competition, and we need to be flexible to beat that competition. So those are some of the ideas, and I wanted to go ahead and open it up now to see if there's any thoughts, comments, questions, snide remarks, whatever happens to have come in along the way. Happy to talk about those things.
No snide remarks, just a lot of thanks for your presentation. We do have a couple questions. I have some on my end, Nathan has some on his, so I'll go ahead and get started. Patricia's asking, you talked about how wealthier people live longer. What would you recommend, how many years would you recommend adding to a typical mortality table to help predict a plan giving pipeline?
So there was a really cool statistic that Brian Klontz presented at the national conference a few years ago, which was from an analysis of those who set up charitable remainder trusts. So these tend to be wealthy people and they're charitable. And what he found was that for a typical 65-year-old female who has actually established a charitable remainder trust, as compared to the national tables, that person will on average live 10 and a half years longer. It's crazy, the longevity of the people who are charitable, especially people that set up CRTs. So I don't have a perfect answer, but it's a long time.
Well, and I know there's been the adage as well with annuities that on average, you extend your life 5 years. I don't think there's any data around that, but it makes sense. People who are planful and go about these things probably have regular doctor's appointments, probably take care of themselves. Those type. I mean, again, there's a lot of things that make sense there. As Jen mentioned,
Nathan, also, I'll jump in. People who are more socially connected at older ages, they live longer. And so charitable giving and social connections tend to go together as well.
No, that's a great point. I know that's a huge challenge for a lot of charities and a lot of donors right now with all of that lack of connection or a different type of connection, mainly via Zoom and GoToMeeting right now. Yeah, we've got a lot of good questions. I did want to touch on real quick because I love it. Again, thank you so much. It's better the second time around, actually. So for those that are listening to it, you may want to come back in a couple days and watch it again. But I love the one where you talk about the failing systems on that data around giving leading up to death. And it's so true. Unfortunately, a lot of charities take a typical type of model or screen they use for major gifts, which makes sense. And they try to apply it to planned gifts. And it reminds me of my grandfather who started our company. He actually took a charity out 2 years before he passed away, or a year and a half, a year before he passed away. But he had dropped off the radar. He had been a supporter of them for 30 years and somehow fell off the radar. And he took that personally and replaced him with a different organization. And so,
yeah, and Nathan, let me also put a positive spin on that. I've been being all negative about don't do these stupid things, but think of the opportunity that creates. If you are top of mind, if you're the one who is communicating to your oldest friends, no matter what, think of the opportunities there if you actually do it the right way.
Yep. Yeah, no, again, great opportunity. And we've always been big believers in making sure you don't forget about those lapsed donors because they could be in lapse for a variety of different reasons. And sometimes you don't know. We do have a couple questions, as Jen mentioned. A good friend, Janet, has a question around legacy society and inclusion. So if a donor is making major gifts from assets now, should they be included in your society? Case in point, last year, 250,000, this year, 200,000 from assets. What's your thought on recognition there?
Yeah, no, I think you want to keep the Legacy Society separate, that is for those who have included an estate gift. And then hopefully you can use that as a motivation to get that donor to include a gift. And, look, when we're motivating donors to include those gifts, we want to make sure we're not using death motivation. We don't want to say, hey, put us in your will because you could get hit by a truck tomorrow, right? That's not going to work. Instead, we want to talk about how, they could be really influential as an example to others if you would allow us to communicate that you've made this kind of a gift, or we've got a campaign to reach 100 planned bequest gifts by the end of the year. We're halfway there. Would you consider joining in and coming to our celebration dinner when those become a thing again for this? So we do want to have that separate, but we want to motivate the action with non-death related motivations.
Yep.
Okay, I have another question that came in. Pamela says that you've talked a lot about old, wealthy, childless people, and she can see leadership going after them at around age 90 when they really have no significant gift history. She's wanting to know how important it is to identify these people earlier on and developing relationships with them before they're too far along.
Yeah, so again, it's always great to get in the plan early. One of the things we know from the statistics is that the longer a charitable component has been in an estate plan, the larger that gift is. So we want to start with, don't ignore your oldest friends, right? Especially those who have had a long history of connection with the organization. So that's the starting point. Now, can you begin a relationship, begin that sort of a connection with somebody who's in their 80s and 90s? We can argue about that. From the behavior that I have seen, I think the answer is yes. And one of the reasons is we do see a shift in the kinds of organizations that people will have in their estate plans. Once we, look, who gets the dollars? Who gets the dollars? And we know this from the UK data because we have organizational level data. Are causes that are naturally in front of people in their 80s and 90s. What's in front of their people in their 80s and 90s? It's healthcare and it's pets, right? Also maybe some veterans organizations, some hospice, other things like that. Those organizations have sort of a natural advantage. Now, if that's not your cause, that's okay, but you've got to do it intentionally, right? You can't just sort of lay back and it's going to happen to you. You've got to create and build those relationships and make the connections with people. And I got to tell you, all this stuff I'm telling you, the statistics, here's the reality. I'm making your life way harder, okay? Because it would be so much easier if you could just work with people your own age. Once you're in the will, you can count it, forget it, you can ignore them. You don't have to work with old people, grumpy people that voted the wrong way or whatever it is that you want to deal with. I mean, I get it. I'm making your life way harder by saying, no, these people change their mind at 85 and at 88 and 90, and you've got to stay connected with those people. But it is the statistical reality. I'm so sorry to break the news.
Well, it's so true. And again, that's one of the things, especially in plan giving. And I think this year, again, being an optimist, that I think there's going to be some silver lining coming out of this year that maybe, especially the importance of stewardship, with something plan givers always say they don't have enough time for. Hopefully that gets a little higher on the radar this year. And I think we're seeing some really cool variations of that. And I'll finish with one last question, as I know Jen's bringing up our last slide. And we're at the top of the hour. But it does tie into that premise of, your longest friends and how do you keep engaged, and so much of our work in plan giving being around, it's not just getting them to raise their hand, it's getting them to continue to have their hand raised until that gift matures. Yeah, a question for Diane is around, do you advise periodically checking in with donors using a recommitment form? What are your thoughts on that type of engagement?
Yeah, I think if that's done appropriately and sensitively, it can be great, especially if you're giving credit to the fundraiser for maintaining those relationships. If it's a face-to-face, hey, how are things doing? Just checking in with you and looking, okay, so you're still at this address. Any changes to your family? Is everybody doing okay? And we have you as a member of our legacy society. Are your plans still in that space, or if you can confirm those things, I think it can be. I think it could be very powerful. And the other thing to keep in mind is, look, when you've got one of the things, look, the majority of, not dollars, but the majority of donations from estate gifts will come from people who weren't necessarily even your donors. But one study actually dug deeper and found that typically those people do have lifetime connections with the organization. Maybe they're your volunteers, maybe they had some employment or family, there's connections there. So that speaks to the idea that when you've got anybody with a lifetime of connections, once they reach a certain age, you've got to stay top of the mind. You cannot go radio silent. We've got to stay top of the mind with these folks, whether they're giving to us at that point in their relationship or not. We need to stay top of the mind.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and break in here because we are a little bit past our time, and I just wanted to do a couple closing notes. We did not get to all the questions today, so if you did have an additional question that you would like to talk with Dr. James about, we have his email address on the screen right there, russell.james@ttu.edu. You can also reach out to Nathan or myself if you have any questions about the webinar or Stelter's products or services. And then finally, a question that I got throughout the webinar was, I really need this PowerPoint deck, and can I see the recording? And the answer is absolutely. We are recording the session today, and the recording and the handouts will be made available on our website at stelter.com/webinars. That usually takes me a day or two, and I will send an email out to everyone who registered to let you know when those assets are available. So that wraps things up for us today. I just wanted to say thank you again to Dr. James for sharing your expertise with us over the last hour. I know we had about 500 people that logged in and spent the last hour with us. So thanks so much, Dr. James.
Glad to be here.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Don't forget to register for our final webinar of 2020. It is with Johnny Hayes on December 2nd. You can go to stelter.com/webinars and get registered for that. Thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Russell.
Thanks, Nathan.
Take care.
You too.